We're going to take a look at photosynthesis. And remember, this is where we're going to convert light energy into chemical energy. And it's a two-part process. The photo part of photosynthesis refers to the light-dependent reactions, where light energy is going to be converted into chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. And then the synthesis part of photosynthesis, synthesis means to make, and this is called the Calvin cycle. So in the Calvin cycle, we're going to fix carbon dioxide, which just means we're going to take the carbon dioxide from the air and make it part of an organic molecule. And we're going to use that carbon dioxide to make glucose. So here's just a nice overview of photosynthesis. And we start over here with the light energy. And we're going to start first with our light-dependent reactions. So they always have to occur first. And so light-dependent reactions are going to capture the light energy and convert that light energy into the chemical energy of ATP and also into our electron carrier NADPH. And the ATP and NADPH are going to be needed for the second part of photosynthesis, which is the Calvin cycle, which is going to be the part that goes up the hill to combine the carbon dioxide, those carbons together to make the glucose. So the NADPH, our electron carrier, is going to take the electrons off of water, so we're going to break apart the water. And in the process, we're going to make oxygen, our waste product. And then those electrons from water get put onto NADPH, our electron carrier. And then during the Calvin cycle, the electrons on NADPH get dumped onto carbon dioxide. And so that'll help join the carbon dioxide, the carbon there, and join those together to help make the glucose. And because we're doing an anabolic exergonic reaction, where we're taking smaller molecules and making something bigger, we need energy to go up the hill, and that energy is coming from the ATP made by these light-dependent reactions. So the Calvin cycle needs the ATP made by the light-dependent reactions in order to go ahead. And then once the photosynthetic organism makes the glucose, so they're able to make their own food, what do they do with it? Well, they just go ahead and do aerobic respiration. So they can take the glucose, and in the presence of oxygen, they can break the glucose down that they've just made, release that energy, and then capture that energy and store it temporarily as ATP. And then later on, they can break the ATP down, release the energy, and then use that ATP energy to do work. So maybe they're doing chemical work, maybe they're doing some anabolic reactions, maybe they're doing some transport work, maybe they're doing some sort of active transport, or maybe they're doing mechanical work. Maybe they're doing something like moving flagella, or the cell is dividing or something. So they're doing something like that. Okay, and this is in a eukaryotic cell. So remember, eukaryotic cells have organelles like chloroplasts. And here we've got a chloroplast with the thylakoids, those little green discs inside. And the green discs are where the chlorophyll pigment is located, and that's where the light-dependent reactions are going to be occurring. So that's where we're going to be capturing the light energy and converting that into ATP and NADPH. And in the process, we'll be making oxygen, our waste product, as we break apart the water to get the electrons off. And then the Calvin cycle, that's where we're going to take the carbon dioxide, we're going to fix it, make it part of an organic molecule, and make the glucose from that. That's going to be occurring in the stroma, so that'll be out in the liquid part, kind of the jelly-like material that's out in the chloroplasts. Okay, there's a number of different photosynthetic microorganisms, and the ones that I want you to be familiar with, the eukaryotic microorganisms that are photosynthetic, I just want you to know about the algae. which we've learned about before. So the algae are photosynthetic and they have chloroplasts because they're eukaryotes. And then the bacteria that I want you to know about that are photosynthetic are the cyanobacteria. And they do not have chloroplasts because they are prokaryotes. So they don't have any organelles at all. And then there are some others that are also photosynthetic, but you don't need to know those. And then there are some halophiles that do use energy from the sun, but they're not using photosynthesis like what you've learned about before. They use it in a little bit different way. So the halophiles that are living in the Great Salt Lake, they do use the energy of the sun, but they're just making ATP with it and not actually making glucose with it. Okay, and there's actually two different types of photosynthesis. So the type that you've learned about before we call oxygenic photosynthesis. So oxy is talking about oxygen and gen means to produce or create. So this is the photosynthesis that creates or produces oxygen as a waste product. So this is what we're used to thinking about when we think about plants doing photosynthesis, and this is the type of photosynthesis that cyanobacteria up here on the top do, and then algae here on the bottom also will do. And that's because they're using water to break apart to get electrons from, and that's how the oxygen is being produced. But there's also another type of photosynthesis that you've not learned about before, and they call it anoxygenic photosynthesis, and an means without. So this type of photosynthesis does not produce oxygen. And that's because they're not using water as a place to get electrons from, they're using something else. And so oxygen will not be produced. So like these purple bacteria or green bacteria that are in this test tube over here, they're doing anoxygenic photosynthesis. So maybe they're using sulfur or hydrogen gas to get their electrons from to do photosynthesis. So they're not going to be producing oxygen at all. And then over here on the bottom left is a picture of purple bacteria that have overgrown in this pond, which would be pretty cool to see if you saw a purple pond like that. Okay, you don't need to memorize these formulas, but all I want you to get out of this is that oxygenic photosynthesis, you do end up producing oxygen. And that's because you're ripping apart water to get electrons from, and you produce oxygen as a waste product. But in anoxygenic photosynthesis, you're using something else as an electron donor that's not water, and so you end up not producing any oxygen. Okay, and then this table, you don't need to memorize at all either, but these first two columns are just showing you examples of oxygenic photosynthesis, maybe with some algae, eukaryotic microorganisms, and then also some cyanobacteria. And then over here on the far right, we've got some anoxygenic photosynthesis, maybe with some green or purple bacteria. So you can just look at that, but you don't need to memorize that. Okay, and then looking at the first part of photosynthesis, we're going to focus on the oxygenic photosynthesis. We'll look at our light-dependent reactions. So the important thing to remember here is that light-dependent reactions, we're going to be capturing the light energy, and we're going to convert that light energy into the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH, and we'll split the water, rip it apart to get the electrons, and in that process we're going to release oxygen as a waste product. I would know where the light-dependent reactions are occurring, so I definitely would star that in your notes. So that would be a pretty easy test question for me to ask you. So I could ask, for example, maybe you've got some algae, eukaryotic microorganism, where would they be doing their light-dependent reactions? Well, that would occur in their thylakoid membranes and their chloroplasts. And we'll take a look at some pictures here in a minute. but prokaryotes, like cyanobacteria, remember they don't have any chloroplasts because they're prokaryotes, no organelles. So where they do their light-dependent reactions, where they're going to put their chlorophyll is in their plasma membrane. Okay, you don't need to memorize the structure of chlorophyll, but remember that there are some different types of chlorophyll, which you don't need to memorize, but they absorb different wavelengths of light, so different colors. And you can notice that photosynthesis is going to occur best in the blues and violets, and also in the reds and orange ranges. We really can't do any photosynthesis in the green color. So if you're trying to grow something that's photosynthetic in green light, it's going to die. Okay, so the chlorophyll pigment that's going to absorb the light energy, they're going to be arranged in these photosystems. And I think it's just easier just to look at a picture of a photosystem. So this is what a photosystem looks like. It's this purple structure here. And notice that these photosystems have to be embedded in a membrane. Okay, so the photosystem consists of some proteins, and embedded in those proteins are the green chlorophyll molecules, or sometimes they might be a little bit different color depending on what type of chlorophyll you've got. And the light energy will hit the chlorophyll molecule, and then we'll pass the light energy around until we pass it to this reaction center complex that's in the middle of the photosystem. And in the center of this reaction center complex, there's a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules. So they will absorb that light energy and then boost up their electrons. And then those electrons will then get sent down an electron transport chain, which we'll look at in a little bit. Okay, and then very important to know where these photosystems are located in prokaryotes. So remember that prokaryotes don't have any chloroplasts. So where they're going to put their photosystems, the only membrane they have would be their plasma membrane. Okay, but in eukaryotes, they do have their chloroplasts. So where they're going to put their photosystems would be in these little green discs, these thylakoids. Okay, so in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplasts, that's where they're going to put their photosystems. Okay, so I definitely would know that for the exam.